Turkey's economy is making a surprising comeback. Russia's economy is overheating, Western workers are struggling to find a job again, Ethiopia gets an initial IMF bailout, and China presents new plans to reboot its struggling economy. These are, in my opinion, the most important economic stories that we need to talk about in this economic update. So let's dive into our first story right away, which is about Turkey's economic comeback. A comeback that was made official when Turkey returned $5 billion to Saudi Arabia because it felt it no longer needed that money to defend the value of the lira. This is a huge change from just over a year ago when Erdogan lowered interest rates just before his re-election. At that time, the Turkish currency was doing so poorly that Erdogan had to rely on wealthy foreign backers like the UAE, Qatar and Saudi Arabia to keep the lira from collapsing. So how did Erdogan go from that state of despair to returning $5 billion to the Saudis? And is Turkey's economic comeback sustainable, or is this just another temporary moment of relief before the lira collapses again? Well, as I talked about in my previous videos about Turkey, the two main reasons the lira was losing value was that, number one, Turkey was running a large trade deficit, and that, number two, both Turks and international investors preferred to swap their liras for foreign currencies where they could earn a good interest rate with much less volatility. So if the Turkish government no longer needs foreign money to defend the lira, it either has a better trade balance or more investments, or both. If we look at Turkish trade balance, we can see that while it is still mostly negative, it has indeed improved somewhat. But the most spectacular improvement comes from the investment side, where especially foreign investors bet big on the lira, increasing their holdings of Turkish debt from 0.6% last year to a whopping 6.7% today. But why did all of this happen? Well, for now, the answer simply seems to be that the new Turkish finance minister has raised interest rates by a lot, from 8.5% last year to 50% today. This made borrowing much more costly, reducing imports and thereby improving the trade balance. On top of that, it made the lira more attractive to hold for both foreign and local investors. However, this could be unsustainable for two reasons. First, while 50% interest seems extremely high, it can also be seen as very low if you consider that inflation is still around 70%. Not surprisingly, inflation is expected to remain very high for quite a bit longer. Such a high inflation rate means that saving in liras will remain unattractive, and in turn this means that dollarization and the volatility that comes with that will likely remain a big problem. The second reason why Turkey's comeback may not be sustainable is that the increased foreign investments are mostly in the form of so-called hot money investments, meaning that this money can leave quickly at the first sign of trouble, causing the lira to collapse once more. So to summarize, yes, returning billions to the Saudis is good news for Turkey, but as we have seen in Argentina, even high inflation countries may from time to time attract enough foreign investors to stabilize the currency. But if inflation is not stamped out, the currency is likely to keep crashing again and again. A state that Turkey's regional rival Russia now also seems to be drifting towards, as there are now more and more signs that Russia's economy is overheating. The most important sign of this is that Russia's central bank recently increased its interest rate to 18% in an effort to stop inflation rising further above its current rate of 9%, which is quite far above the 4% target. Luckily for ordinary Russians, this inflation has not been very painful because wages have risen much faster than prices. As a result, Russia's economy currently finds itself in a massive spending boom. This is of course a completely different scenario than what Western politicians had in mind when they imposed sanctions on Russia after it invaded Ukraine. So how did Russia go from recession to such a massive consumer boom that it is causing inflation, a phenomenon known in economics as an overheating economy? According to Russia's central bank, the spending boom is mostly caused by two types of government spending. Firstly, Russia's government is borrowing a lot to recruit more and more soldiers to fight in Ukraine. Increased wages for soldiers are in turn pushing up wages in the private sector. Secondly, Russia's government has stimulated key sectors like agriculture, heavy industry, but also real estate by subsidizing loans. Therefore, interest rates in these sectors, as well as mortgage interest rates, are well below the 18% interest rate set by the central bank. As a consequence, Russian workers are spending like there's no tomorrow, and property prices are surging, both contributing to inflation. So could Russia be going the way of Turkey with ever-increasing inflation, or will Russia's conservative central bank counter government spending with ever higher interest rates and thereby creating a recession in Russia? We'll have to see, but for now a recession looks unlikely as ordinary Russians are profiting from a super tight job market and all the perks that come with that. Something that stands in stark contrast to Western countries where workers are increasingly struggling to find work. Because while unemployment is still relatively low, it is now again rising in Europe, Australia and in the United States. Other signs that the balance of power is again shifting back from job seekers to bosses is that in the UK, stock prices of major recruitment firms are down, UK companies are not advertising as many jobs anymore, and even in the US, workers stopped quitting their jobs as much to look for better work. This means that the unique situation after the pandemic, in which there were fewer workers available and demand was still high thanks to government stimulus and low interest rates, which meant that workers felt that they were able to switch jobs and ask for better working conditions, well, this condition may now be over. So are bosses back in control for good? Well, I'm not so sure. On the one hand, sure, interest rates are still high and many government spending programs have come to an end. But on the other hand, we have now entered an era of dropping populations and potentially increased defense and industrial spending. This is why major central banks, such as the ECB, think that it is increasingly likely that Western countries will find themselves in a higher spending and higher inflation scenario. A scenario that, while far less extreme, may share some characteristics with the situation in Russia, where workers are in short supply. But of course, it could be that both governments and Western central banks act strongly to avoid that because they want to avoid a scenario such as the following, in which Ethiopia just received a mini IMF bailout. Specifically, it got a loan package worth around $3.4 billion from the IMF because it was running out of foreign currency. However, it only got this after promising to let the value of the currency be determined by the market, after which the Ethiopian birr promptly dropped by around 30% when compared to the US dollar. This will likely increase inflation in Africa's fifth largest economy, an economy that was up until just a few years ago frequently compared to East Asian tiger economies thanks to its rapid economic industrialization and growth. But after the country's brief civil war in its northern Tigray region ended in 2022, Ethiopia's economy has struggled with foreign currency shortages as it imports way more than it exports, and both investments and foreign aid have dried up. So is this IMF bailout then enough to relaunch Ethiopia's economy? Probably not. Sadly, Ethiopia's problems are so big that it will likely burn through these $3.4 billion in just a few years. Therefore, this mini bailout should be seen as a first step in the country's ambition to secure a larger $10 billion bailout from the IMF. But for that package to be unlocked, the IMF demands that Ethiopia reforms its economy more in the direction of a market economy rather than a state economy, which it is now. But structural reforms like that are very difficult, as one of Ethiopia's role models demonstrated once more when China presented new reforms during and after the Chinese Communist Party's so-called Third Plenum meeting. The announced reforms include both good and bad news, but overall the conclusion of many economists and journalists was that the bad news dominated. Now, before we get to the announced reforms, I just want to clarify that I define good news as proposed reforms that help China's economy to rebalance towards more sustainable growth by increasing domestic demand. As I discussed in my previous video, China suffers from a chronic demand shortage because it has suppressed household incomes to power its growth miracle. Such a strategy can only work for so long, but if China can now increase household income and thereby consumption, it can increase its own Chinese economic growth while simultaneously helping out the world, which is struggling with increased Chinese exports and reduced Chinese imports. The good news is that at the Third Planet meeting, the CCP recognized the problem of low demand and in response announced measures ranging from more baby subsidies, lower interest rates, better access to social security for rural workers, and increased pensions. All of this could help the Chinese consumer and rebalance China's economy. However, the bad news is that the CCP did not focus on these reforms, but rather on the reforms that will push exports even higher, such as China's drive to become increasingly self-sufficient in high-tech areas and thereby enabling it to make almost everything at home. On top of that, China's leaders have promised for decades now that they wanted to increase the power of the Chinese consumer, but so far it has been a lot of bark and hardly any bite. Therefore, I think it is still very likely that China's economy will continue to slow down while the world continues to struggle with a country that is too big to export its way out of trouble, but will try to do so anyway. Which brings us to the end of this economic update, a format that I'm currently experimenting with. If you want to see more of it, please consider supporting the channel on patreon.com/moneymacro or by becoming a member using the button below.